So throughout this unit, we've been looking at various ways in which sort of interactive methods can extract data from subjects. These are cases where you are influencing in one way or the other the subjects that you're trying to get data from. And in the case of something like a survey, you are doing so as little as possible, but because you're asking questions, you're poking the subject in one way or another. In the case of ethnography, you're deeply involved in a relationship of some sort with a community. And so that's even more of a sensitizing position in which you may be shifting the thing that you're observing. In an ideal world, you're observing things that, if I'm a biologist and I'm looking at bacteria, at least theoretically, the fact that I'm looking at them through a microscope is not going to change them. And you can find parallels for that, and we'll move to less invasive kinds of methods in the coming module. But throughout this module, we're looking at more traditional cases in which we actually are interacting with our subjects in one way or another. I could have like 8 or 10 separate units just on this, and again, just touching on these. But this is the etc. or kind of what's left over, where I just want to at least lightly touch on a couple of other ways in which people make use of methods that are like this or variations of those methods. And the way that I'm gathering these together is thinking a little bit about if you're working on in a user experience group, someone who's doing UX work. There are some fairly traditional approaches that people will take, and UX has varying definitions depending on the institution you're in. It goes all the way from kind of user interface stuff more specifically to really broad questions of experience with a brand or with an organization. And so I just wanted to touch, I'm using that as a catch-all really, just to kind of touch on some things that we didn't touch on that you may have questions about. And if you have questions about others, if you want to go through the full catalog of possible methods, it's fairly long. And so I just wanted to touch on some of the ones that you might run into that are more popular. We talked about interviews being one-on-one interviews, but group interviews are also very much possible. There are a couple of different forms of group interviews. Generally, these are kind of called focus groups, and focus groups are one type of group interview. These might be classified into the ways in which the group is related. So in some cases, you do a group interview because the group is a team, and part of what you're doing is asking them questions and getting answers, but part of what you're doing is figuring out how they interact with those answers. So in this case, you can record both how they're answering questions, what their answers are, but also how they're answering questions, how they interact with one another, who defers to whom, that sort of thing. So in that case, it's an established group, and your interview really is of the group. This would happen in organizational contexts more than anything else. It may be in concert with interviewing people individually, right? You might either start with individually interviewing people and then following up with the group, or more likely the other way around, where you interview the entire group, figure out what the dynamics are between the players, and then interview each person separately afterwards and try to figure out kind of what happened in that conversation as well, as you kind of pick the people apart and figure out how they're related. But mostly what you would be doing is a focus group. And often the way that I've seen this put out is that someone who I actually have not watched Mad Men, but I have to assume that Mad Men includes focus groups. And so that's why managers say, why don't we do a focus group on this? And a focus group in that context, and in most of the ways that they're deployed, is really used for a couple of different things. Often what it's used for is kind of a quick gut check to make sure that whatever it is that you've developed as a message, as a system, is not stupid, right? You're showing it to a small group before you roll it out to a larger group and make a fool of yourself. So some of this is a gut check kind of a thing. Some of it is intended to brainstorm a bit, like you bring in a group of your users or your clients and you say, okay, so how do you use these? When do you run into problems? And it's a way of generating ideas that you can then kind of build off of. So in some ways it is an interview, right? It's you are trying to get information out of them. But if you'll recall, when we talked about interviews, you were supposed to be addressing a very specific set of questions, and it's really hard to do that within a focus group. I mean, you can, but it's hard to do. And part of the reason for that is that there are advantages to the inter-subject conversation and disadvantages. Let's start with the advantages. The advantage is you really don't have to do the silent time, right? The fact that other people are talking often means that it draws people out of their shell a bit. They might feel more comfortable when they're not one-on-one with an investigator. They might feel more comfortable if they feel like they're with a group of peers or other individuals. They might enjoy it more to be in that group and be in a conversation if it's not too large a group. So this is one way in which it can be helpful. It can be helpful because it allows for drawing out of non-standard ideas. So you can say, okay, that's a great idea. Does anyone have anything else? Does anyone have anything else? Does anyone have anything else? So you can get at some of the more marginal ideas that if you were doing this one-on-one, you might get the same, because you might get the most popular answer from everyone. And you might not have this opportunity to kind of press people for their own personal views that differ from the group. So that's helpful. As I said, you can get the social dynamics in a way that you can't otherwise, and you can kind of get the personality of your respondents and how that might, the psychographics of the people who are responding and how that might relate to what they're telling you, their opinions, their attitudes. These are all very good. You might also get some idea of shared language, of kinds of things that people use as shared language. So I was looking at Instagram, and within certain communities, they have terminology that you might not know if you hadn't done this. So in that case, it's sort of a cheaper way, or one way, I guess I should say, to get at some of the things I talked about in ethnography, where you're trying to get some of the inside language and some of the ways in which people consider and use the system, right? If you're talking about a system. There are disadvantages, and you may already have anticipated a lot of these. One is that there will be a dominant speaker. It's really hard to avoid this, and sometimes it's just you work around it. Someone is always going to be the first to speak, is always going to want to keep speaking. That's often me. But there's going to be some dominant voice, and that is not necessarily a problem in itself, although it can certainly become, from a dominant to a domineering voice. And so with experience, you can diffuse that a bit. But it's really hard to diffuse it entirely. And that can just really, you've paid a lot of people to be there, and one apple can ruin that whole process. And so that can be a significant challenge. That whole social desirability bias that you had before, which was the subject trying to impress you, with experience, you can diffuse that a little bit by doing some mirroring, by making yourself smaller, by making yourself a little more bland, right? By not trying to show them up, by making sure your language is accepting and open. But when you put a bunch of strangers in a room, there's a very good chance that someone in that room is going to try to impress the other people in that room. There's a very good chance everyone is going to be doing that to a certain degree. And as a result, you have a bias built in of people trying to sort of represent their identity in a way that is favorable to the other people in the room. So that's pretty tricky. There's often a race to consensus. This is the groupthink problem. When you get a bunch of people in the room, the first thing that comes out is going to be something that is more likely to be agreed upon. You really do have to do some of the things you do around brainstorming to make sure that you're accepting a broad range of possible responses. And you really have to kind of do something to drive that out. Now, there are some interesting ways to do that in moderating, and in selecting your participants in the right way, and in kind of thoughtfully interpreting and as you do with interviews, representing that to the group. There's also ways you can do that by deliberately, you may have seen this kind of in the context of politics as well, that is deliberately putting two groups together that have opposite views, not so opposite that they are attacking each other, hopefully, but it gives you a chance to kind of look for commonalities, and once you've done that, and contrasts, and once you've done that, it almost sets it up to kind of build that commonality and contrast piece. And that can be useful, because then you have them drawing each other out and trying to distinguish them from each group from each person and each group from each other. And that can be helpful. If you do that, sometimes it's helpful to do that with two different moderators who are representing two different views. That may be with a split group, or it may just be with any group where you come up and you say, you have someone there this is where the idea of the devil's advocate comes to break down the issues of false consensus and groupthink. So you might have a devil's advocate, someone, hey, this is the good cop, bad cop thing, where you come in and say, I really want to talk about what we like in this system. And the other one's like, I really want to hear what's bad about this. I really want to make sure that I can bring to my bosses why we want to get rid of it. So you could kind of do the good cop, bad cop there. This doesn't fit in as a methodology, but there has been some work done on kind of deliberative democracy, and not just kind of trying to build ideas, but actually presenting a bunch of data to potential users or to clients or to citizens and saying, here's everything we know, presented in a way that hopefully is digestible by you, and then having them discuss this. Again, this isn't usually used as a social science method, but it certainly could be on the edge of something like a focus group, because and we've done this a little bit in academic settings too. This is basically what a seminar is, right? But we've done this where we've kind of had an expert or two experts present something, then bring people together in groups to discuss it, and then split back out and ask the expert something or something like that. And if you're recording and kind of observing that and interpreting it well, it really can give you a lot of information about both what people think about the topic, in a kind of generative way, but also about how they interact about these things. And so, again, that's really at the edge of being an investigatory method and a more participatory building method, right? And as I said, I really think that when we're doing this stuff, and in many cases, that line is not as clear. It is maybe made too clear. That is, we have this view that we should be observers first, But given that my interest is in fixing problems, if I can co-opt my subjects and make them participants in fixing that problem, as a consultant especially, that can be a pretty powerful thing to be able to do. All right, so focus groups, this is why I didn't do a whole thing on it. I actually don't, in most contexts, especially research contexts, I don't think they're very useful, but people, they have a bit of a halo effect. People know what they are, they've heard what a focus group is, and so they think they can run focus groups, and that it will be a cheap and easy way to generate information very quickly about a user base, about customers, about clients, about citizens, about whatever, right? And I don't want to dismiss it entirely. It's just that you need to think seriously about where it can be useful, especially in exploratory work or idea generation, and where it might not be as useful. A very common method used in user interface especially is an interview with the technology. And this is often called think aloud or sometimes called type and talk, where you kind of give the person some set of tasks for using a new app, or for using an app or a website or some other technological artifact, right? And you just ask them to talk out loud as they're thinking through things. There's a movie that you probably haven't seen because it's an older one called Long Kiss Goodnight, with Gina Davis and Samuel L. Jackson in it. And in that, he, as he's getting dressed, he actually says what he's doing. He sings his way through it, right?
Put my glasses in my pocket. Da, 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 da. Put the jacket on the chicken. Da, 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 da. I sing the things I do, so I won't forget. Like da 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 da, turning off the downstairs light. Da 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 da, before I go to bed at night. Da, 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 da.
And so that's kind of what you're trying to get people to do. You're trying to get their internal narrative, their internal voice externalized, so you can kind of see, and and now I'm clicking on this, but where is it? I know it's here somewhere. I can't find it. Maybe I'll look at this menu. Now I'm looking at this menu. And because of that, you could kind of interpret some of that by mouse movement, or by, if you've got, glance detection, you could see where they're looking on the screen. And you can do that in addition to kind of this think aloud piece. But that gives you some idea of how they're interacting with a piece of technology, in the same way that if you saw them interacting with a person, they'd probably be verbalizing that. But this kind of asks them to be slightly introspective. And some people do this much, as subjects, do this much better than others do. Some people that you have to keep reminding them to talk. I have a feeling that probably those who have an internal voice are it's easier for them to externalize that. And those of us who are weird and don't actually have a voice in our head, we have to work harder to turn our thinking into a voice. So it's a method that's pretty widely used. It's one of the older methods in user interfaces, and it can be pretty effective in finding branch points where people are having trouble, where your application or your website or your whatever, your interface is not matching the more traditional mental models of the user. It can get at some of the assumptions that you've made, that things that are obvious to you, but that the average user is not making sense of. And generally speaking, kind of places where you have cognitive load, where you have some kind of hesitation or confusion, this point where people stop. So if you can notice those stop points and why they're stopping there, you can potentially iron those out of an interface. To do this effectively, you have to make sure you're using tasks that are realistic, that are things that you really expect people to do with these technologies. You need to, but then you need to sit back and let them actually do stuff with that task and let them kind of work their way through it. You have to be willing to kind of, as people slow and are concentrating, some of this maybe because they're having trouble, you may have to say, and what are you thinking about now? Again, it can be annoying, but you've got to kind of prompt them to keep going. And kind of one of the points here is that all users are different. And so what you're looking for here is not like what is this particular user having trouble with, but presumably you're video recording this, audio recording it. So it's not what is this particular user having trouble with. It is, what are their common points? Can you see a pattern across a small sample of users that are working through these same set of problems?
A new competence model and add one competency.
Oh, that is sweet. Well, this one is private.
I don't know. Maybe you find a hint on the site. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So this is the type of the relationship between two competencies, but good that you saw that there's a difference.
That is just funny that you have everything green in front of it. It was confusing at the beginning. So you were telling to make You were telling to make a competency.
Yes. So you need to add one new model and then add one competency.
Okay. My competency model. Looks good. Create new competency model. Competency model name. My name. For competency models, I will be graph equals.
You can certainly do this online now, especially with cameras and that sort of thing. It's doable. It's still easier to get some of the proxemics and some of the frustration and some of those other pieces when you put them in an artificial environment. But there are advantages to doing it at a distance as well. So, and that can be anything from just, using Zoom and saying record your screen to a full takeover of their machine or their phone. So there's a variety of ways you can kind of engage in this and get that information from people. Again, mostly this is for user interfaces, but increasingly a lot of what we do is interface related. So there may be other places this can show up. You might be able to do this, for example, in trying to figure out people's mental models around algorithmic sorts and things like that. Perhaps even older than that is a technique used in information architecture called card sorting. And traditionally, this is meant for things like if you have to build a menu, you can get users to help you come up with that menu organization by giving them cards and having them kind of sort them into piles that make sense as they're clustering, and then they can name those sorted piles. So that's kind of one of the traditional ways of thinking about it, which is building an architecture for a website, for an information system, for whatever, for an application. But we can go a little bit wider than that too, right? Because we're going to be doing our own analyses where we're doing classification. But getting people that are subjects to do that classification can be useful in a pretty wide set of contexts. So it's something worth at least thinking about. It's very straightforward. It's very easy. It's very sort of something that subjects very quickly come to grips with. You can either do it, where it's open card sorting, where you just give them a deck and say, lay it out, sort them into files as you like and figure it out. Or you can give them, if you want to, this is the case, again, in the case of something where you already are designing something with some kind of hierarchical architecture, you can kind of give them headings and say, okay, where do each of these cards go in this, or some combination of those two. And so this is a way of thinking about, of trying to have people, this is a different kind of thing, right? It's a way of having people come to grips with I will throw this in there. I've used this in the past, where you're not actually sorting into piles. It's not a classification, but you kind of move things in the space so that they're closer or further apart from one another. I've used this actually to talk about social networks within an organization where I had names and pictures of people. And I said, just kind of put it out on the table and move them around to who you think is closer to whom in terms of sort of trust and working together. And so that gave me kind of a way of getting people's ideas of what the social network looked like. I've done that both with individuals and then also done that as a group exercise and figured out how people talked about that, because it started to, they'd take a person and they'd have to, they're really close, and someone would say, oh no, I don't think they're that. I think they just really dislike each other, but they're watching each other closely. So you get kind of some of the dynamics in the room that way, especially but in both ways, like either where the people are in the room themselves that way and have to negotiate that, or where they're talking about a group that isn't actually in the room. Both of those can be really kind of interesting. Now, that's a very specific sort of use of this, but it's also I'm giving that as an example of two things. One is it's not doing information architecture; it's actually asking people about social networks. And two, it's not a classification problem; it's a distance problem, right? And so you can do that with conceptual distances as well. Here are photographs of the major, the 30 most sold cars in the U.S. Put them on a table and say which of these, how do you cluster these, not in piles, but which are closer to which, right? So there are other ways you can do this, and I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility, right? And perhaps it is appropriate to end with the most sciencey of all scientific methods, which is doing experiments. And traditional experiments, where you randomly assign subjects to two different conditions or multiple conditions, and then measure some outcome of those conditions. That's kind of especially in the sort of behavioral sciences, that is a mainstay. If you came out of a psychology program, you've already done a lot of this. And traditionally, the way you do that is in our building, you go to the basement where we have rooms set up where people can run experiments, and you bring a bunch of subjects in. You hope that you do your best to do a sample of subjects that are representative of a population. You randomly assign them to two conditions or multiple conditions. You run them through an experiment. You find out whether the outcomes are different and in what ways. And then you can kind of, because you have controlled a lot of the potential bias around this, and because you have comparison to a control group, this gives you very, I think, a convincing set of responses. It gives you pretty good strength in terms of arguing that you have observed something real. And so it's hard to get past that. It's good generalizability. We've got great statistical methods for determining whether the differences that you're seeing are real differences. It really kind of hits on all the sciencey side of the methodological question. Again, if we're trying to cluster these all under user experience, it's rare that you do this. I have seen it done where people have given people two different interfaces and run them through kind of the same sets of exercises, maybe think aloud with these two. And that is a kind of pseudo experiment. You do have kind of natural experiments. I would argue that you could sort of do that by looking at, say, different subreddits or something like that, where you have different conditions and you kind of are passing through it. That's not really an experiment, but it has some ties to kind of an experimental method. You aren't actually manipulating it in that case. This is what a natural experiment is. You're looking for manipulations that kind of have naturally occurred. But for UX, by far, the most common is A/B testing, right? And things like content platforms and a bunch of other stuff are really set up at this point for A/B testing because it is so common. This is where you change the design for some of your users, for example, and don't for others. And if you've ever used Amazon, you've been part of an A/B test, whether you know it or not, right? When they decide to make a change to the website, they will change it for a few thousand people or a few 100,000 people and see whether it leads to more engagement, see whether it leads to more sales, see whether it leads to different kinds of behaviors that they want to encourage. This has actually set up a pretty strong system of micro testing and micro experimenting for things like cognitive tasks online. Unfortunately, it's being used by platforms to drive their product, that is the users, in ways that are useful to them. Increasing engagement, increasing repeat users, increasing dwell time, ultimately to increase their ability to sell things to you in most cases. So I'm not sure, this isn't on the ethical side, that application isn't very useful. But if you're interested in kind of what the effect of an interface is, for example, it's hard to beat A/B testing, especially if you can run large numbers of subjects through it. So in traditional A/B testing, you've got, you have a lot of statistical power when you're running 100,000 people through it. And, if you run 100,000 people through, the alternative, a new design, and you increase sales by 0.05% or 0.005%, with those kinds of large numbers of tests, you actually can see very small changes in outcome. And what that means is that people can iterate little by little towards their desired outcome. That I have not seen a lot of experiments in our programs. It would be interesting, and it's a possibility. I would say this is in some ways the most. It can be the least biased if you're very careful about thinking about bias in the more traditional experimental setting. But it also is very much. You are. You may not be shocking your subjects, but you are involving them in a very direct way, and so you have the natural problem of. Normally of trying to remove yourself from that so that you're not biasing them. In this case, you're trying to not bias them in most ways, but you are changing something. You are kind of affecting them directly in a very purposive way and trying to see what effect that has on them. So yes, it's certainly an option, but I just don't see it used as often as you might expect. So as I said, there's lots of other possibilities here, used both in UX and used in various social science and more practical research. But I think this gives us a kind of a broad overview of some of these more traditional, more invasive, more affected forms of methods. When we move from here, we'll be talking about methods that are less that take the researcher a little bit more out of the circle. And maybe what I will do, I'll do this here instead of there, is to talk about this is to bring up a set of research projects about 100 years old now, when people were worried about the effect of the Nickelodeons on children. And the concern was Nickelodeons were making our children stupid and scared and all kinds of other stuff. And so the Pain Fund laid out a fairly large amount of money to a bunch of psychological researchers to find out about how strong the effects of watching movies were on children. And this was actually kind of a methodological smorgasbord. I mean, it kind of drove a lot of the methods in the understanding of media for the next 30 or 40 years. I would say there was someone that came out of the Frankfurt School, although he's not a Frankfurt schooler, named Paul Lazarsfeld, who during the late 1940s, early 1950s, started to do things like the first metrics on people watching the debates on TV and being able to kind of give ongoing feedback as to how they were feeling about a particular subject, and a bunch of other kinds of innovative results looking at audiences, especially radio audiences and television audiences. But before that, a lot of these methods were coming out of the Pain Fund studies. And, so those ranged across a whole bunch of different approaches. Some of the early kind of work on uses and gratifications came out of this, a tradition where you asked what people were getting out of these films, and you found out that kids were going there to do things like social learning. How should I behave at a restaurant? How do I get boyfriends and or girlfriends? What do I do on a date? Kind of pretty explicit kinds of modeling and social learning. And so you did that mostly through interviews and talking to them about kind of what they got out of it. So you had a lot of these interviews. You had diary approaches, especially early on for radios, television, a lot of this media study stuff. People use diary approaches and log approaches where you ask people to kind of record their usage and their thoughts and things like that. These don't work very well. I mean, I'll just leave it at that. It's really hard to get them to be valid, and people tend to fill out the logs right before they're supposed to turn them in. So it's not a very good approach in my opinion, and its lack of use in the last few decades is an indicator of that. But so on the one hand, you had that kind of directly interviewing people and those keeping the diary. Those are both very sort of interactive and a measure that it was very obvious you were asking them for stuff. But there was an interesting one that kind of slipped under the radar here, which was they actually wired kids' beds to find out how much they tossed and turned at night. And so the idea was, like, if they were having nightmares, you'd actually have a method of this without asking them about the nightmares. Asking kids whether they're having nightmares runs into all kinds of problems, right? You have to they have to be willing to tell you this without trying to impress you by saying, oh no, I don't have nightmares, I'm not scared by anything. You have to assume that they actually remember that they had a nightmare, which is not always the case. And so what they figured out was they could put basically a seismograph under their beds and figure out how much deep sleep they were getting and whether they were waking up in the middle of the night. And so this is an interesting kind of shift, right? So on the one hand, you have all these things where you're asking them questions. You have to worry about the whole psychological issue of whether they're telling you the truth, whether they know the truth, whether they know themselves, all of those problems that you have with some of the methods we've talked in this unit. In the next unit, we'll talk about things that are trace data, things that are archival, things where you are not interacting with your subject at all, and where you have to worry a little less about that sensitivity. Brings up a whole host of other problems, but at least that question of sensitization is reduced somewhat.